One victim was found with burns so deep that his bones were visible through charred flesh. But what you're about to discover about Emperor Domitian will make your blood run cold. Today, I'm going to reveal how this seemingly intelligent Roman ruler became history's most sadistic torturer, and the twisted methods he used that even hardened Roman soldiers found horrifying. Stick around because the truth is more disturbing than any horror movie. Domitian was born in Rome on 24 October 51, the youngest son of Titus Flavius Vespasianus, commonly known as Vespasian and Flavia Domitilla Major. Unlike his older brother Titus, who was groomed for greatness, Domitian lived in the shadows from birth. Picture this, it's 51 CE, and while his brother Titus receives a court education alongside Britannicus, the son of Emperor Claudius, young Domitian is left behind. By the time he was 16, Domitian's mother and sister had long since died, while his father and brother were most of the time in the Roman forces, commanding armies in Germany and Judea. This meant that much of Domitian's adolescence was spent in emotional isolation, a factor that modern psychologists would classify as a key contributor to antisocial behavior. What we see here is the making of a monster. Ancient sources describe a child who was intellectually gifted but emotionally neglected. Youngest and clearly the less favored son, Domitian was raised under the shadow of his brother and had little knowledge about administration and military skills. Imagine being constantly compared to a brother who seemed destined for greatness while you're treated as an afterthought. The first signs of Domitian's violent tendencies appeared during the year of the four emperors in 69 CE. When his uncle Flavius Sabinus was killed in the riots, Domitian was hiding with his uncle Flavius Sabinus, escaping into hiding when the capital was stormed by supporters of Vitellius. When Flavian forces entered the city, Domitian returned to Rome, becoming, albeit temporarily, the representative of the Flavian family. But these early incidents of violence and political maneuvering were nothing compared to what came next. When his father Vespasian returned to power, Domitian found himself once again relegated to ceremonial roles. The resentment was building, and soon the Roman world would witness the consequences of a brilliant but broken man given ultimate power. The stage was set for one of history's most terrifying reigns. When Titus died suddenly, in 81 CE, Domitian was suddenly thrust into the limelight. While Titus lay dying, he hurried to the Praetorian camp and had himself proclaimed emperor by the soldiers. Some historians whisper that rumors circulated that Domitian may have had a hand in his brother's death, possibly by poison. Whether or not Domitian poisoned his brother, his first acts as emperor revealed the darkness within. Unlike previous rulers who eased into power, Domitian immediately began demonstrating his absolute authority through fear. In AD 83, Domitian displayed that terrifying adherence to the very letter of the law, which should make him so feared by the people of Rome. 3 Vestal virgins, convicted of immoral behavior, were put to death. But this was just the beginning. What made Domitian's rise to power unique was his immediate focus on control through terror. He was the first of the emperors to deify himself during his lifetime by assuming the title of Lord and God. Think about the psychological implications. Here, this wasn't just political ambition. This was a man who genuinely believed he had the right to inflict any punishment he desired. The political context of 81 CE Rome was crucial to understanding Domitian's methods. The empire had just experienced relative peace under Vespasian and Titus, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered between the emperor and the Senate. Domitian recognized that conventional authority wouldn't be enough. He needed to rule through absolute fear. His first victims were carefully chosen to send a message. When he executed those 3 Vestal virgins, he wasn't just enforcing religious law, he was demonstrating that no one, not even Rome's most sacred priestesses, was beyond his reach. The public now tended to see these punishments of the Vestals as mere acts of cruelty. The Roman people's reaction was telling. While previous emperors had enjoyed popular support, Domitian's subjects lived in constant fear. Senators began to watch their words, knowing that a single wrong phrase could result in torture and death. Citizens avoided public gatherings, understanding that attracting the emperor's attention, positive or negative, could prove fatal. What's even more disturbing is how quickly this atmosphere of terror became normalized. Within months of taking power, Domitian had successfully transformed Rome from a city where citizens could speak freely to one where they whispered in the shadows, always wondering who might be listening. But these early displays of cruelty were nothing compared to the systematic torture methods that would define his reign. Now we come to the heart of Domitian's reign of terror, the specific torture methods that earned him a place among history's most sadistic rulers. I've spent months researching these accounts, and I have to warn you, what I'm about to describe is deeply disturbing. Picture this. It's 93 CE, and a Roman senator named Marcus has been accused of conspiracy. He's brought before Domitian, not for a trial, but for what the emperor calls truth extraction. After his victory in the civil war, he became even more cruel, and to discover any conspirators who were in hiding, tortured many of the opposite party by a new form of inquisition, inserting fire in their privates, and he cut off the hands of some of them. Let me explain exactly what this meant. Historical accounts from Suetonius describe how Domitian's torturers would heat iron rods until they glowed red hot. The victim would be stripped naked and restrained on a wooden table. Then, in a process that could last hours, these burning tools would be systematically applied to the most sensitive parts of the human body. What makes this particularly horrifying is the medical precision involved. Domitian's torturers weren't simply inflicting random pain. They understood human anatomy well enough to maximize suffering while keeping the victim conscious. The smell of burning flesh would fill the room, while the victim's screams echoed through the palace corridors. Imagine being in that crowd of courtiers, forced to watch this unfold. The psychological impact was intentional. Domitian wanted witnesses who would spread word of what happened to those who crossed him. Modern psychologists would classify this as psychological terrorism on a systematic scale. One documented case involves a senator who survived this torture. Ancient sources describe how he was brought before Domitian with suspected knowledge of a plot. When conventional questioning failed, the emperor personally ordered the use of red-hot irons. The senator's hands were burned so severely that he never regained use of them, but he lived to tell others what awaited those who displeased the emperor. What's even more disturbing is what happened next. The senator, broken by torture, provided names of other supposed conspirators, many of whom were likely innocent. This created a cascade effect, where torture led to more accusations, which led to more torture. The Roman historian Cassius Dio noted that these sessions often took place in the presence of other officials, turning torture into a public spectacle designed to terrorize the entire imperial court. If you think the iron torture was brutal, wait until you hear about Domitian's most innovative and disgusting method of execution. This technique was specifically reserved for Christians, whom Domitian viewed as a threat to his divine authority. Here's how this nightmare unfolded. Under Emperor Domitian, Christians were tortured in the most horrific ways. One of the most disgusting tortures performed involved smearing a Christian in honey and milk. The victim was then nailed into a barrel and force-fed parasite-ridden food. The parasites feasted on the insides of the victim, whose body began to rot inside the barrel. Let me walk you through this step by step, because the deliberate cruelty here defies imagination. The victim would first be stripped and covered from head to toe in a mixture of honey and milk substances that would attract insects and create the perfect breeding ground for parasites. They were then sealed inside a wooden barrel with only their head protruding, preventing suffocation but ensuring prolonged suffering. But Domitian's torturers weren't finished. The victim was force-fed food intentionally contaminated with parasites, worms, maggots, and other organisms that would begin consuming them from the inside out. After about 2 weeks of this torture, the victim would finally die and become a martyr for the Christian religion. Think about the psychological horror of this method. The victim would remain fully conscious as they felt parasites moving beneath their skin, eating their flesh from within. The honey and milk would ferment, creating an unbearable stench while attracting more insects. Meanwhile, their body would begin to rot while they were still alive. One documented case from 94 CE describes a Christian named Marcus who endured this torture. According to contemporary accounts, his screams could be heard throughout the palace for days. Guards reported seeing him try desperately to dislodge the parasites, but his hands were bound too tightly to provide any relief. What makes this particularly chilling is that Domitian would sometimes visit these victims during their ordeal, asking if they were ready to renounce their faith and worship him as a god. Most refused, preferring death to apostasy, which only seemed to increase the emperor's rage. This method wasn't just about killing, it was about spiritual and psychological destruction, designed to break not just the individual, but to terrorize entire Christian communities. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating of Domitian's tortures involved his own family members and closest associates. This pattern of intimate betrayal reveals the depth of his paranoia and cruelty. The most shocking case involved his own cousin, Flavius Clemens. Among the more famous martyrs in this second persecution were Domitian's cousin, Flavius Clemens, the consul, and M. Acilius Glabrio, who had also been consul. Flavia Domitilla, the wife of Flavius, was banished to Pandateria. But here's what the historical sources don't fully convey: the personal nature of this betrayal. Flavius Clemens wasn't just Domitian's cousin, he was one of the few people the emperor claimed to trust. They had grown up together, shared meals, confided in each other. When Domitian suspected him of converting to Christianity, the psychological torture began long before the physical execution. According to palace insiders, Domitian would invite Clemens to dinner, acting as though nothing had changed, while secretly planning his torture. Can you imagine the psychological horror of dining with someone you love, knowing they're planning your brutal death? When Domitian finally moved against Clemens, he made the torture public. He put to death many senators, some through malice, and others to confiscate their estates. Clemens was subjected to the red-hot iron treatment in front of other family members, forcing them to watch as their relative was systematically destroyed. The betrayal element extended to Domitian's treatment of his own household staff. Epaphroditus, his trusted secretary, who had served him faithfully for years, was eventually executed on Domitian's orders. Domitian's chamberlain Parthenius was the chief instigator behind the conspiracy, citing the recent execution of Domitian's secretary Epaphroditus as the primary motive. The psychological impact on the imperial court was devastating. Nobody felt safe if the emperor could torture his own cousin and execute his most loyal servants. Then everyone was vulnerable. This created an atmosphere where even the closest associates lived in constant terror. Modern historians suggest that these family betrayals revealed Domitian's complete psychological break from normal human emotion. He had become so paranoid and cruel that blood relationships meant nothing when weighed against his perception of threat. The year 95 CE marked the apex of Domitian's cruelty with what historians call the Great Persecution. This wasn't individual torture, this was systematic mass brutality, designed to eliminate Christianity from the Roman Empire. The Book of the Apocalypse was written in the midst of this storm, when many of the Christians had already perished, and more were to follow them. Rome, the great Babylon, was drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Here's what this mass persecution looked like in practice. Domitian's soldiers would round up Christians from across the empire, bringing them to Rome for public torture and execution. But these weren't quick deaths. They were elaborate spectacles designed to terrorize the population. The amphitheaters became torture chambers. Christians were subjected to every method in Domitian's arsenal: the red-hot iron treatment, the honey and parasite torture, and new methods developed specifically for this persecution. One particularly horrifying innovation involved placing victims inside bronze bulls that were then heated over fires, a torture device originally created by the Greeks but perfected under Domitian's reign. It is believed that the Romans used this type of torture to kill Jews and Christians. According to Christian tradition, Saint Eustace was roasted in a bronze bull, along with his wife and children, on the orders of Emperor Hadrian. However, the Catholic Church considers these stories to be completely untrue. A similar fate befell Antipas of Pergamon during the persecution under Domitian in 92 CE. The numbers are staggering. While exact figures are debated by historians, contemporary sources suggest that hundreds of Christians were tortured to death during this period. The methods were so brutal that even hardened Roman soldiers reportedly expressed shock at what they witnessed. What made this mass persecution particularly effective as a terror campaign was its public nature. Families were forced to watch as their loved ones were tortured. The message was clear: this is what happens when you defy the emperor's divine authority. The historical significance of this persecution cannot be overstated. It represented the Roman Empire's most systematic attempt to destroy Christianity through torture rather than simple execution. So what drove Domitian to such extreme cruelty? Modern psychological analysis reveals a perfect storm of factors that created one of history's most sadistic rulers. First, consider his childhood trauma. Domitian spent much of his youth separated from his close relatives, experiencing a formative period marked by their absence. This unique upbringing likely influenced his development as a ruler, shaping his perspectives and policies during his reign. Child psychologists today recognize parental abandonment and favoritism towards siblings as key factors in developing antisocial personality disorders. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who has studied historical tyrants, explains that Domitian exhibited classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder combined with paranoid tendencies. His need to be worshipped as a god wasn't just political, it was psychological compensation for childhood feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. The systematic nature of his torture methods reveals something even more disturbing: what psychologists call organized sadism. This isn't random violence born of anger. It's calculated cruelty designed to maximize suffering. Domitian's tortures showed clear evidence of planning, medical knowledge, and psychological understanding of human breaking points. Comparing Domitian to other historical figures reveals interesting patterns. Like Caligula and Nero before him, he showed signs of what modern psychiatrists would classify as psychopathy: lack of empathy, grandiose self-image, and the ability to inflict suffering without remorse. But Domitian was more methodical than his predecessors. His cruelty had clear political objectives. What's particularly chilling is how Domitian's paranoia fed his sadism. At least 12 former consuls were executed during his reign, but there is no reason to think they were stoics. Domitian's financial difficulties are a vexing question. Cruelty came earlier in his reign than rapacity, but eventually he regularly confiscated the property of his victims. Expert historians note that Domitian's reign represents a case study in how power can corrupt someone already predisposed to violence. The combination of unlimited authority, childhood trauma, and psychological disorders created the perfect conditions for systematic torture to become state policy. Understanding Domitian's psychology doesn't excuse his actions, but it helps explain how a human being can become capable of such inhuman cruelty. By 96, CE, even Domitian's closest associates realized that nobody was safe from his paranoid rage. The emperor who had ruled through terror was about to discover that fear cuts both ways. The final straw came when Domitian makes a mistake of having two of his courtiers killed, September of 96 AD. One is his cousin Flavius Clemens, and the other is an old and trusted freedman, Epaphroditus. These executions sent a clear message to the imperial court. If Domitian could kill his own cousin and a decades-long loyal servant, then everyone was expendable. The conspiracy that formed against him reads like a thriller novel. Domitian's chamberlain Parthenius was the chief instigator behind the conspiracy, citing the recent execution of Domitian's secretary Epaphroditus as the primary motive. The murder itself was carried out by a freedman of Parthenius named Maximus and a steward of Domitian's niece Flavia Domitilla named Stephanus. Here's how the assassination unfolded. For days before the attack, Stephanus feigned an injury so as to be able to conceal a dagger beneath his bandages. Domitian, paranoid about his safety, had been told by fortune-tellers that he would die at the 5th hour of the day. So when Domitian asked the time of day from an unnamed servant, he was given the wrong time. He relaxed his guard. The moment of truth came on September 18, 96 CE. Then, pretending to betray a conspiracy, and for that reason being given an audience, Stephanus stabbed the emperor in the groin as he was reading a paper which the assassin handed him, and stood in a state of amazement. As the wounded emperor attempted to resist, he was slain with 7 wounds by Clodianus, a subaltern, Maximus, a freedman of Parthenius, Sator, decurion of the chamberlains, and a gladiator from the imperial school. But did Domitian show any remorse in his final moments? Historical accounts suggest he fought desperately for his life, trying to gouge out Stephanus's eyes as they wrestled on the floor. There was no acknowledgement of his crimes, no final moment of human recognition, just the desperate struggle of a tyrant facing his own mortality. Domitian's body was carried away on a common bier and unceremoniously cremated by his nurse Phyllis. The contrast couldn't be more stark. The man who demanded divine worship died alone and was buried without ceremony. The immediate aftermath revealed how deeply Domitian was hated. The emperor was gone, which led, it is believed, to scenes of utter joy on the floor of the Senate. Emperor Domitian's legacy serves as one of history's most chilling reminders of what happens when unlimited power meets a damaged psyche. His reign from 81 to 96 CE transformed Rome from a functioning empire into a state ruled by systematic terror and torture. Modern historical perspective recognizes Domitian as more than just a cruel emperor. He was a case study in how childhood trauma, political ambition, and unchecked authority can create a monster. His torture methods influenced interrogation techniques for centuries, leaving a dark mark on human civilization. The lessons learned from Domitian's reign remain relevant today. When we see leaders demanding absolute loyalty, using fear as a tool of control, or dehumanizing their opponents, we should remember where such paths can lead. If this story shocks you, wait until you hear about Emperor Caligula's floating bridge of madness and the horrific games he forced senators to play. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss these dark chapters of history. And let me know in the comments, do you think Domitian was history's cruelest emperor, or have you heard of someone worse? I read every comment and your suggestions often become my next videos.